History of media laws in Iraq. In 1921, the press law was enacted during the British Mandate period, imposing restrictions on freedom of expressions and granting the authorities with power to close newspapers and imprison journalists. A few decades later, in 1954, Iraq became the first Arab country to ever broadcast from a TV station. The arrival of mass media such as television and radio occurred at a time when only the states were able to dispose of the necessary resources, thus turning stations into tools of nationalist propaganda. A few years later, in 1968, the Ba'ath Party came to power in Iraq under Saddam Hussein's regime. Media censorship became widespread and strict control was imposed on the press and broadcast media. Soon after, in 1973, the Revolutionary Command Council (RCC) issued Law No. 68, which established the General Security Agency. This agency was responsible for monitoring and controlling media and further tightening the government's grip on freedom of expression. In the 1980s, the Iran-Iraq War led to increased propaganda and state-controlled media, with media outlets required to disseminate pro-government narratives and censor information that could be deemed detrimental to the war effort. Then in the 1990s, following Iraq's invasion of Kuwait and subsequent international sanctions, the state's control over media intensified. Media outlets became mouthpieces for the government and independent journalism was severely curtailed. In 2003, with the fall of Saddam Hussein's regime, came a period of transition and media reforms in Iraq. It was in March 2003 that the Coalition Provisional Authority (CPA) took control of Iraq and abolished the pre-publication censorship through Order No. 14. Finally, in 2004, the Iraqi interim government passed the Iraqi Media Network Law, establishing the Iraqi Media Network (IMN) as an independent public broadcaster, and the Communication and Media Commission (CMC) was established as an independent regulatory body to oversee the media sector. Soon after, in 2005, the new Iraqi constitution was adopted, enshrining press freedom and freedom of expression as fundamental rights. Article 36 explicitly prohibited censorship. In the same year, 2005, the Journalistic Protection Law was enacted, providing some legal protections for journalists and specifying penalties for crimes committed against them. In 2006, the General Secretariat of the Council of Ministers issued Order No. 65, which outlined the regulations for obtaining and renewing licenses for media outlets. 2 years later, in 2008, the Journalistic Profession Law was enacted, this time to regulate the rights and obligations of journalists and the practice of journalism in Iraq. Later in the same year, the right to access information was also passed, aiming to promote transparency and provide citizens with the right to access public information. After a while, in 2010, the CMC established a code of conduct for journalists and media organizations outlining ethical standards and professional guidelines. A year later, in 2011, the CMC issued regulations on media coverage during elections, ensuring fair and unbiased reporting. Then, in 2013, the Access to Information Law was passed once again, aiming to promote transparency and provide citizens with the right to access public information. 2 years later, in 2015, the Iraqi parliament passed the Law of Freedom of Expression and Assembly, which reaffirmed and strengthened constitutional protections for freedom of expression. A year later, in 2016, the CMC introduced regulations on social media platforms, which required online media outlets to register with the Commission. Then again a year later, the CMC introduced new regulations on satellite TV channels, aiming to ensure compliance with ethical standards, avoid incitement to violence, and combat hate speech. In the following year, in 2018, the Iraqi parliament passed the Cybercrime Law, which included provisions related to outline content and digital communications. Critics expressed concerns about potential restrictions on freedom of expression and privacy. In the consequent year, in 2019, the CMC issued regulations on media coverage of demonstrations and protests, outlining guidelines for responsible and unbiased reporting during public gatherings. Then, in 2020, the Iraqi parliament passed the Law of Information Crimes, which aimed to combat disinformation, fake news, and online defamation. This time, the critics raised concerns about potential misuse of the law to suppress freedom of expression. In the year 2021, the CMC announced a draft law to establish a new media regulator, the Independent Media Commission, replacing the CMC. The proposed law aims to enhance the independence of the media regulator and promote transparency in the media sector.